I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Natalie Boymel Kampen lecture. I want to thank various people for their work in making tonight's lecture possible. All of the BCRW staff, including Tammy Navarro, Hope Dector, Eve Kausch, Pam Phillips, and Avi Cummings, as well as the BCRW student research assistants staffing tonight's event, Asha Futterman and Kayla LeGrand. I also want to thank the folks in events management, the AV staff, the caterers who have arranged a beautiful reception after the talk behind the shoji panels over there. So please stay for the reception. And especially the facilities staff who always make our spaces beautiful for us so that we can have these kinds of events. I also want to mention that Word Up Community Bookshop is here. Danielle and John are over by the red tablecloth. Word Up, as some of you who have come to other events of ours know, is our book-selling partner. Word Up is a volunteer-run community bookshop and art space in Washington Heights. I'm a volunteer there, so sometimes I'm sitting over there selling books, but not tonight, because we have able people doing so. So please check that out. Sign up for the mailing list, buy a book, and learn more about Word Up's work in Upper Manhattan. All right, now to the main event. I'm delighted to introduce the Natalie Boymel Kampen Memorial Lecture, a now annual event here at Barnard. Tally, as everyone knew her, was a pioneering scholar of art history and gender. As a much beloved member of Barnard's faculty from 1988 until 2009, Tally chaired women's studies for many years and established strong foundations for the current Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at the college. She was the inaugural occupant of the Barbara Novak Chair in Art History at Barnard, as well as a valued member of the graduate faculty in art history at Columbia. An internationally recognized scholar, Tally's research focused on Roman art and architecture in the imperial period. Her work took place at the intersections of art history, archaeology, classical studies, and feminist theory. She was the author and editor of several books, including her last publication, Family Fictions in Roman Art, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2009. Tally passed away in 2012, but we keep her spirit in our midst by honoring her memory every year with a distinguished lecture delivered by a colleague working in one or more of her fields of expertise. And I just know that Tally would be extremely pleased that we have invited Danielle Padilla Peralta to deliver this year's Kampen Memorial Lecture. Danielle Padilla Peralta is Associate Professor of Classics at Princeton University. He's co-edited a volume on appropriation in Roman culture for Cambridge University Press. It's a book called Rome, Empire of Plunder, The Dynamics of Cultural Appropriation. And his monograph, Divine Institutions, Religions and Community in the Middle Roman Republic, is forthcoming from Princeton University Press. He has also published a prize-winning memoir, Undocumented, a Dominican boy's Odyssey from a homeless shelter to the Ivy League, which is available for purchase at the Word Up table. Don't miss it. I want to say just a few words about Professor Padilla Peralta's scholarly work, especially its range. I spent the last several days reading a lot of his scholarship to prepare for tonight, and I'm really humbled by his presence here because his work is really extraordinary. He's first and foremost a cultural historian of the Roman Republican period, and he brushes up against the imperial period as well, working in interdisciplinary fashion with a range of literary and material sources. But he's also concerned with the reception of Greco-Roman classical antiquity in American and Latin American cultures. His recent work on slave religion in the Roman Republic, on notions of migration, refugee status, and citizenship through the lenses of island studies, his work on divination and ecology in Cicero, and on the reception of classical antiquity and Caribbean political theory. This is just to name a few of the topics he's published on recently. All of this work moves comparatively and elusively back and forth between antiquity and the contemporary world. Emblematic of the imbrication of classical studies, cultural critique, and political intervention, and this is just one exemplar from this body of work, I'd single out an article that he published in 2019 entitled Citizenship's Insular Cases, From Ancient Greece and Rome to Puerto Rico, which invites us to think about the metaphors and figurations of islands and archipelagos in theorizing citizenship as both a mode of belonging and also a mode of regulation and exclusion. Tacking between Homeric epic, Roman history, post-colonial theory, and contemporary African and African-American literature, he urges us to think about displacement and exile, refugee status and precarity, and differentiated citizenship across geographic and temporal divides. In addition to his scholarly work in Roman history and religion, comparative studies, and classical reception, he's also contributed to critical engagement with the literature and culture of the Dominican Republic. I've had the opportunity to hear him speak at 2 recent academic symposia held at Word Up Community Bookshop. Can you tell I was slipping that in? One was devoted to the poetry of Pedro Mir, the poet laureate of the Dominican Republic who passed away in the year 2000, and another devoted to the poetry and translation work of Dominican-American poet and scholar Rina Espaillat. So you can hear from all of this the kind of range of his intellectual interests and expertise. I always learn so much from Donnell's presentations at conferences and symposia and from reading his work. I'm deeply grateful to him for his intellectual generosity, his collegial solidarity, and his friendship. And I know we all are going to learn much from him tonight, from his provocatively entitled lecture, The Haunted House of Classics. So please join me in welcoming Professor Donnell Padilla Peralta to Barnard. Thank you.
We can't shake hands anymore. It's perhaps for the best. So I'd like to begin by thanking everyone who's made tonight possible, especially Elizabeth Castelli, for extending the invitation, for welcoming me to Barnard, and for encouraging me, humoring me to give this talk on the Haunted House of Classics. When I talk about the haunted house tonight, I'm going to be doing 2 things. I am going to be gesturing in the direction of histories of classical scholarship, and I'll explain in a few minutes how I situate myself and my work in relation to those histories. And I'm going to talk about some actual haunting, chiefly my own sense of being haunted, and the configurations that that haunting has taken in recent years. To that end, I will begin the talk with 3 stories. They concern incidents that occurred during the 2018-19 academic year. And my objective with each of these stories is to tee up the major themes that will then thread through the next 2/3 of the talk. The darker side of classics and its exhibition of a mode of disciplinarity that's equal parts vampire and cannibal. The anti-blackness of classicism, made operational through protocols of racial mystification and veiling, and the persistence of racial amnesia within classics, as showcased to spectacular effect in histories of classical scholarship. I will conclude by shouting out a poet mentioned by Elizabeth, Rina Espaillat, and a poem that she introduced me to and introduced all of us who participated at the academic symposium this past fall to, that has struck a chord with me and that has been a site for some of my recent reflection on how to do the history of classical scholarship better. Story 1. In November 2018, I returned to the Dominican Republic for 2 reasons. First, to photograph several monuments in Santo Domingo for a chapter-length study of Dominican classicism that's finally out in the world between the covers of the OUP edited volume Classicisms in the Black Atlantic. And second, to pick up a box of papers and books that had belonged to my father, who'd passed away that summer. I had not been looking forward to this trip, partly because the memories of my final interactions with my father before his death from chikungunya-related pulmonary complications had twisted me into a bit of a hot mess. I hadn't been at his side when he passed, and I hadn't traveled to Santo Domingo for his funeral, because I told myself at the time I wanted to spend time alone with my grief and not repeatedly justify myself in front of family members who kept asking why I hadn't traveled down for the final days of his life. And because the self-defensive voice in my head went on there wasn't anything to be gained from whipping myself into emotional turbulence in the weeks before the submission deadline for 1, my book manuscript, and 2, my dossier for reappointment. How the demands of the Academy interfere with and actively work against the ethical imperative to be humane is a question that's not far from my mind these days. But that summer and early fall, I was trapped in the position of being able to formulate the question without actually grasping what its answers might mean for me and for my grief. In any case, by November, I was in a state of acute regret about my original decision and about the tortured because verging on dishonest rationales behind it, but I had to go on this trip. The monuments that I had planned to photograph were a cluster of 3 classicizing statues of Bartolomé de las Casas, the protector of the Indians, Enriquillo, the indigenous Taíno chief who warred against the Spanish colonizers and settled in Hispaniolas mountains with fellow free indigenous folks, and Sebastián Lemba, the Cameroonian Maroon who oversaw one of the most vigorous and sustained challenges to colonizer predations on the island in the early decades of the Conquista. This cluster was outside of the Museo del Hombre Dominicano on Avenida Pedro Enriquez Ureña in the capital. And following my visit to this cluster, I planned to snap some photos of the colossal statue of Fray Antón de Montesinos on the beachfront, which rises right where the Ozama River lets out into the sea with its back to the colonial zona and its face pointed to that neighborhood across the river bay that's named Sans Souci. The 2 monuments are separated by a 15-minute drive, for which I was joined by my mother and stepfather, who were down in Santo Domingo for a short vacation, and 2 of my cousins. On our arrival at the Museo del Hombre Dominicano, we discovered that both the museum and the surrounding perimeter had closed early for the day, perhaps for pavement work, but there were also troops patrolling the interior perimeter, so who knew? I hadn't come all that way not to snap photos. So as my cousins looked on, I went up to the perimeter wall and fence, and I tried to scale it. Not the smartest idea, one of my cousins commented, because you could get shot. Better, she suggested, for one of us to ask one of the patrolling soldiers to take a photo of the statue cluster with my phone. And so for once, heeding the advice of one of my relatives, I walked with my cousins to the east perimeter gate. She waved over one of the soldiers, who was an early 20-something, if that, but who carried some pretty menacing heat in his hands, and explained that we wanted a photo of the statue cluster. He smiled, he walked off with my iPhone, and returned a few minutes later with a few photos. We thanked the joven militar and went on our merry way to buy and eat pizza at the beach. Despite having access to other photos of this statue cluster, both online and in Jeanette Candelario's marvelous book, Black Behind the Ears, Dominican Racial Identity from Museums to Beauty Shops, I felt this compulsion to take my own photo. Ostensibly, the motivation was to minimize the likelihood of any rights and reproduction issues when the chapter went to press. Always got to think about these rights issues. But more than anything, I wanted, first, to get close to the statues, to appreciate and critique their bronze neoclassicism, the handiwork of the Spanish Dominican sculptor Antonio Prats Ventos, and then to have this triptych in the palm of my hand, securely stored away in my iPhone. And finally, to confront in their metal presence the conjunction of the national and the personal as an Afro-Dominican classicist who, in the course of multiplying his intellectual and professional attachments, had lost his father. But in the end, there wasn't any unmediated encounter. The strong arm of the Dominican state was there to take care of the photographing for me. Some 36 hours later, I was at the airport, waiting for a flight back to Newark, comfortably settled into my gate seat and reading my father's beaten-up copy of César Nicolás Pinzón's Cosas Añejas, a book originally published in 1891, a collection of semi-fictionalized relatos of Dominican history that had first crossed my radar thanks to the work of Lolgia Garcia Peña, and whose commingling of brutally explicit anti-Haitianism and anti-Blackness with a very sedulously crafted appropriation and weaponization of classics slotted well into my research on Dominican classicism at the time. Suddenly, as I sat at the gate, my name was called, and I had to go back to the screening area. The X-ray screening of my luggage, into which I packed my father's effects, had turned up something suspicious. Presenting myself to the screeners, I was taken to a back room for interrogation by military police. Did I know that I was carrying bullets in my luggage? No. Surprise, surprise. In the box of my father's belongings, my cousins had packed several mementos that he'd kept from his time in the Army. He had completed his national military service decades before I was born. He'd actually been discharged from the Army not too long before the Museo del Hombre Dominicano opened. And he'd never been particularly forthcoming with me about his experiences in the military. Among the mementos, there were a few bullets, which had been carefully wrapped and bundled together with his military decorations. I hadn't even noticed the wrapping when transferring the contents of the box to my luggage. What was I proposing to do with these bullets? Perhaps needless to say, I missed my return flight that afternoon because the authorities had to run an Interpol search on me. The next two incidents took place within 2 days of each other. In March 2019, while I was attending the Langford Conference on New Directions in Roman Slavery at Florida State University, that was co-organized by my colleague Brent Shaw and FSU's Trevor Luke. For the conference, I presented the second version of a talk on epistemicide, a concept that I'd first encountered in the writings of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, while searching for a more dynamic vocabulary to describe the effects of mass enslavement's interaction with ecological disruption in the ancient Mediterranean under Roman rule. What drew me above all else to working with the concept was the weight it attached to thinking of historical phenomena in epistemological terms, a matter of obvious relevance not only to my research in Roman history, but to my study of classical reception and the history of classical scholarship. The feedback on the talk was invigorating, and I looked forward to continuing the conversation with colleagues at the conference dinner, which is being held at a venue off-site. On spilling out of the car and first looking at the layout and architecture of the Goodwood Museum and Gardens in Tallahassee, the venue hosting the reception and dinner, I was bowled over by the realization that we'd been taken to a former plantation. It did not advertise itself as a former plantation, and the signage all studiously and carefully referenced the site's restoration to its 1920s condition. But I know a plantation when I see one. I mentioned this to the conference organizers. We did a little research, and yes, the suspicion was confirmed. Goodwood Museum and Gardens had previously been Goodwood Plantation. Originally a tract that had been included with a land grant bestowed by Act of Congress on the Revolutionary War General the Marquis de Lafayette in 1824, the acreage for the plantation was acquired by Hardy Croom in 1834. Alighting on these basic facts did not require any intensive archival slogging. Wikipedia has an entry on this plantation. It was easy. The question that set up shop in my mind during the conference dinner was why the plantation pedigree of the venue had escaped the notice of those responsible for coordinating the conference logistics. The next morning, one of the co-organizers opened the morning session with some comments on the history of the Museum and Gardens, which he had researched after the dinner, and issued an apology for organizing the conference dinner there. So on one level, the issue was addressed. We were talking about it and would continue to talk about it in the days and weeks to come. On another level, though, the oversight was emblematic to me of a more troubling, because recurring, absent-mindedness on the part of classicists about the conditions and locations in which they produce scholarship. That the plantation past of this venue would probably have gone unremarked had it not been for the one conference presenter who himself descended from enslaved persons was concerning, sure. But what troubled me even more was that the conference did not take up, except incidentally or at a distant remove, the tensions and paradoxes of generating scholarship about slavery within an academic and disciplinary matrix whose existence has historically been and continues to be underwritten by racial slavery and white supremacy. I wasn't under any illusions as to why this was the case, of course, and nor were some of the conference participants. The codependence and collusion of classics and ancient history with regimes of enslavement and colonialism is the stuff of much excellent, recent, self-reflexive work in the field. But once we were safely settled into the numbing routines of conference organization, presentation, and performance, We're lulled into the complacency of believing that our performances with PowerPoint and prose were the most important medium for the transacting of knowledge, when, in reality, the knowledge that called most for acknowledgement and exposition was the ghostly knowledge of the world to which the conference shut its doors, at the same time that the conference liberally feasted on that world and its deliberately suppressed memories. One more surprise was in store for me that weekend in Tallahassee. And this time, it wasn't in the form of Plantation doing business as a dinner venue. It came in the form of an airport terminal doing business as a museum exhibit. The final morning of the conference, I skipped out on a sightseeing trip to catch the first flight back to New Jersey. Because I hitched a ride with another conference goer to Tallahassee's airport, I was early for my flight and could indulge myself in the luxury of killing time while waiting for my connection to Charlotte. Wandering around in the terminal, I came across an exhibit that had been set up by Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, by FAMU, Critical Mass, the Black Intellectual Rediscovered. Split between the airport and the Meek-Eaton Black Archives, this exhibit offers a look at the extraordinary achievements of African-American writers, teachers, and artists at the turn of the 20th century, with several classicists figuring prominently among them, such as Professor R.S. Lovingood of Walhalla, South Carolina, who graduated from Clark University and was eventually elected to the chair of Greek and Latin at Wiley University in Texas, or the Reverend John Bowen of New Orleans, who graduated from New Orleans University and worked as professor of Latin and Greek at Central Tennessee College in Nashville. I'd previously encountered their names in the Black Classicisms exhibit that had been organized and curated by Wayne State's Michelle Valerie Ronick and brought to the Center for Hellenic Studies by Howard's Caroline Stark. But now I had an opportunity to linger over them in the company of the much wider intellectual and social networks in which they had roamed and to which they had belonged, networks that were brought beautifully to life in the exhibit. But this was an exhibit in an airport terminal, in a location where most passersby would not so much as allow themselves the opportunity to linger. And it was curated by faculty and students at an HBCU for whom a cascade of financial pressures unleashed by ever more aggressive cuts in state and federal educational budgets had resulted not just in a run of recent bad news, resignations and terminations of financial administrators being the gloomiest highlights, but in the dramatic constriction of the university's ability and the ability of other HBCUs to deliver the kind of humanistic education that had mattered so much to the intellectuals whose lives and achievements were the subject of the exhibit. Many of them had applied themselves unrelentingly to the task of opening up access to humanistic and liberal arts education to Black youth at the turn of the century. But there was another more classic-specific angle to my negotiation of the exhibit's evocativeness. The conference in which I participated that weekend had not involved any members of the FAMU community. It hadn't even brought to our attention the existence of this exhibit, which commemorated scholars who in several cases had brought their embodied knowledge of enslavement and subjection into direct and continuous dialogue with their study of classics and ancient history. Notably, and unsurprisingly, these scholars, despite the pioneering efforts of Ronick and Stark and their collaborators, have not figured at all in the histories of classical scholarship that anchored the field's articulation and representation of its ontogeny and progression in the United States. Some of these intellectuals had published regularly, and others had combined publication with exquisitely conceived and ingeniously executed approaches to pedagogical empowerment and civic responsibility. But their writings formed no part of the citational economy of American classics. After all, classicists of a traditional stripe, drilled repeatedly from bachelor's to the PhD in the fine arts of bowing and scraping before feats of European and white American doxography, have little feel for anything that does not leave a copiously paginated and citationally fetishizable trail. I was implicated in this too, though. A close friend had urged me to reach out to colleagues at FAMU before traveling down to Florida for the Langford Conference. So why hadn't I? The search for an answer to that question brings me now to the next part of this talk. My proposal is that we think about the various incidents I've described as illustrative in distinct but complementary ways of certain properties of the classical and of classicism that render them prone to ghosting Blackness. From these stories, I want to extract one reasonably coherent meta-narrative, what Avery Gordon has characterized as the, quote, story about what happens when we admit the ghost, that special instance of the merging of the visible and invisible, the dead and the living, the past and the present, into the making of worldly relations and into the making of our accounts of the world, end quote. Classicists not infrequently take pride in bringing blood to the ghost, and to some degree, it may very well be said of classics, the discipline, that it does conform to Jacques Derrida's definition of a hauntology as, quote, the non-contemporaneity with itself of the living present. But the ritual offering of blood to the ghosts is pre- and overdetermined by racial constructs that foreground some spectral presences and shut out others. In other words, the field's capacity to admit ghosts into its midst is regulated, like any other feature of its production and circulation of knowledge, by the racial investments of the living. For such a claim to be fully intelligible, I need first to take a quick detour and consider how the discipline of Euro-American classics has fashioned its dominant identities, by reference to one work in particular. The monumentally long A History of Classical Scholarship, published in 3 volumes between 1903 and 1908, is the culmination of the British classicist Sir John Edwin Sand's indefatigable labors. Before flagging what this work does not contain, and what it in fact diligently endeavors to scrub out of visibility and existence, let me treat you first to the questionable charms and complex pleasures of its exposition. By European country, and by century or 2-century intervals, the latter 2 volumes of the History of Classical Scholarship survey the pursuit of classics from 1300 CE to the present. Its literary mode is almost entirely biographical, with the mostly cut and dry business of educational institutions attended and Greco-Roman authors studied and researched, spiced up from time to time by the suggestive or revealing anecdote. But these anecdotes aren't included for the sole purpose of juicing up the genealogies of the text. They're also included to mold readerly affects and orient dispositions towards the figures who feature in the narrative and the exemplary scholarly virtues or vices that are distributed across its pantheon of literate eminences. In the interest of brevity, I'm going to confine myself to 2 anecdotes, both sampled from Volume 2. While surveying the major actors from Petrarch to the full bloom of the Italian Renaissance, the History of Classical Scholarship quotes at length Benvenuto's arresting description of Boccaccio's visit to Monte Cassino, which was fueled by a desire to see the ancient manuscripts that were held there. I'll quote, "Being eager to see the library, which he had heard, was very noble. He humbly besought one of the monks to do him the favor of opening it. Pointing to a lofty staircase, the monk answered stiffly, 'Go up, it is already open.' Boccaccio stepped up to the staircase with delight, only to find the treasure house of learning destitute of door or any kind of fastening, while the grass was growing on the windowsills and the dust reposing on the books and bookshelves. Turning over the manuscripts, he found many rare and ancient works with whole sheets torn out or with the margins ruthlessly clipped. As he left the room, he burst into tears, and on asking a monk whom he met in the cloister to explain the neglect, was told that some of the inmates of the monastery, wishing to gain a few soldi, had torn out whole handfuls of leaves and made them into psalters, which they sold to boys, and had cut off strips of parchment, which they turned into amulets to sell to women. Despair at the sight of the disrepair of the library and the mangled bodies of these manuscripts, the presumption that this mangling is the consequence of neglect, the revelation that some of the monastery's residents had recycled manuscript leaves as psalters and amulets in order to make some coin. Boccaccio's feelings are centered with a deliberate aim of eliciting a certain set of responses from the reader. This is an exemplary narrative, not only because it communicates the idealized determination of the zealous student of the ancient world, but because it communicates how one should feel when that determination confronts the realities of a present that is marked by poverty, inattention, and the necessity of prioritizing the work of living over the preservation of what is no longer alive. One should grieve and then remonstrate, because what should matter most to the student of classics is not the sight of human beings in destitution or abjection, but the conditions of the text. If there is suffering to care deeply and truly about, it is the suffering of the text and the miserable negligence of those human beings whose material needs has prevented the scholar from accessing the text in its undisturbed glory. On this reading, the saga of Boccaccio's visit to Monte Cassino titrates into the vessel of anecdote, what is ultimately the anti-humanity of the classical, the preference for texts over humans. A wrinkle on this theme is explored a few pages later with the help of another choice vignette. Here, we have recounted the journeys of Poggio Bracciolini, Cencio Justici, and Bartolomeo de Montepulciano in 1416 as they set out in search of manuscripts. So eager was the quest that even the wretched condition of the roads did not prevent Poggio and Bartolomeo and Cencio from sallying forth from Constance and climbing the steep slopes that led to St. Gallen, some 20 miles distant. In that ancient home of learning, they found the abbot and the monks absolutely uninterested in literature, and many a precious manuscript lying amid the dust and damp and darkness of one of the towers of the abbey church, a noisome prison, says Poggio, to which even criminals condemned to death would never have been consigned. Cencio, who was deeply moved at the sight, declares that if those scrolls could have found a voice, they would have exclaimed, "O ye who love the Latin tongue, suffer us not to perish here, release us from our prison." Again, the determination of the classical scholar is lionized and extolled, conditions on the roads be damned, the unnamed human stewards of the text are presumed to be absolutely uninterested in literature, allowing manuscripts to wallow in the subjection of near carceral damp and dark. But the wrinkle of interest to me is first the ventriloquizing of the text, which are imagined as pleading in unison before lovers of the Latin language for their emancipation from prison. And second, the proposition that text can suffer a fate that not even incarcerated humans can. That text can experience an objection that is somehow deeper, and yet by virtue of their standing as Latin text, undeserved and thus more steeringly unjust. Let me recapitulate. Sand's History of Classical Scholarship mobilizes and bundles the propositions that the classical text should command superhuman effort to be accessed, because it is greater than any human, or greater for that matter than human needs. That the plight of texts not yet rescued or delivered from the oblivion of monastic enclosure deserves more sympathy than the carceral subjugation and exploitation of human beings. And that the truly devoted, because tireless in their practice of veneration of these texts, classical scholar has a better understanding of how to take care, how to exercise care of these texts than their presumptive or current stewards. The implications of this argument through exempla are not limited to an analysis of the compositional style or emplotment devices of this history of classical scholarship. They gesture, I would argue, to a fundamental ideological substructure of this work and of works like it, and to the history of classical scholarship as a genre of disciplinary practice whose priorities were defined and enforced by people such as Sands. The ideological substructure comes into focus if we consider the book's omissions. The least remarkable aspect of the history of classical scholarship is that it does not feature a single non-European scholar in its two post-1300 volumes. But that's probably not going to come as a shocker. Arguably more remarkable is that the work so resolutely trains its sights on Europe that it does not and cannot bring itself to acknowledge the extent to which shifts in classical scholarship, in authors read, avenues of research opened up, networks cultivated, so on, were dictated by and answerable to the priorities of European settler colonialism. Why does Roman imperial history and Greek and Roman ethnography surge to the forefront in the 16th and 17th centuries in scholarly venues throughout Europe? Why is there such an escalation of interest not only in Roman law, but in maritime and commercial law, and in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Roman law of slavery? Why, in the 18th century, do British historians of ancient Greece take such an avid interest in the relationship of Greek colonies to their founding metropoles? You will search in vain for answers to these questions in the 3 volumes of this work. The first and only mention of the transatlantic slave trade in this work comes in a discussion of the classical predilections of the great parliamentary orators of the 18th century, which is capped by a brief excursus on William Pitt the Younger. During the peroration of his great speech on the abolition of the slave trade, even his opponents listened to him as to one inspired. The debate had lasted through the night, and the rays of the rising sun were streaming into the house when the orator closed a splendid period on the coming dawn of a brighter day for the natives of Africa with a fine quotation from Virgil. Nos ubi primus equis oriens afflavit aneles, elixera jubens accendit lumina vesperum. And when on us the rising sun first breathes with panting steeds, their glowing vespers kindling his evening rays. Where the classical does intersect with the machinery of empire in this work, it's only as a representation of another species of exemplarity, which is not hard to situate in relation to the ones whose hum we listened for earlier. Sure, classical learning can be a rhetorical embellishment of the kind that spruces up a stem-winding oration. Yet it's also the property and preserve of the architects of empire to be tapped as a resource for prognosticating about the future that awaits the benighted, because we blackened subjects of empire. Invocation of the classical elicits feeling for the subjected on the part of those who hold power over their future. But at no point, either here or elsewhere in these works, is the production of knowledge under the form of the classical understood to hold some responsibility for or to be complicit with the transatlantic slave trade whose abolition Pitt the Younger envisioned. And it should also be noted, apropos of the triumphant citation of Pitt the Younger's oration in this passage, that the 1792 speech did not actually result in the passage of the motion to abolish the slave trade. In any event, few and far between are the references in a history of classical scholarship to the interaction of classics with those colonial and racist imperial orders whose absence would have deprived classical scholarship not only of capital and material, but of its raison d'etre. The amplification of the classical scholar, first as virtuous chaser of lost texts, and then as proud critic and consumer and occasional ventriloquizer of their contents, shuts the door on any attempt, however minimalist or fleeting, to identify the many points of intersection between the practice of classical scholarship and the derivation of material and psychic profits from a white supremacist world system. That Sands was unable to move in the direction of such an attempt is not exactly jaw-dropping news. That late 20th and early 21st century classicists remain incapable of making a concerted move in this direction, though, should be. What I'd like to do for the final minutes of this talk is to outline how the field of classics obdurately persists in enacting white identity politics through its practices. The almost instinctual nature of this refusal comes out in, for example, the British classicist Hugh Lloyd-Jones' complaint in one of his review essays that a bookstore had had the temerity to line up its Latin, Greek, and ancient history shelves right next to Native American and Black studies, as if the latter somehow polluted the former. But this refusal isn't limited to idiosyncratic British classicists and their bookstore layout preferences. To look for the constitutive agency of race in the discipline's meditations on its own history is to be confronted almost immediately by silence. That these histories are often arranged as concatenated biographies is part of the problem. With their pious focus on the individual classicist institutional pedigrees and other race gestae, these histories, for the most part, don't discern or so much as acknowledge the benefits that many of their shining lights derive, directly or indirectly, from the conjoined forces of white supremacy and Euro-American settler colonialism. Politics, religion, ideas shape the individual, according to Calder and Briggs and Calder, 1990, but apparently not race. Not one biographical entry in the Biographical Dictionary of North American Classicists even so much as mentions the structural force of racism in the antebellum or postbellum United States. And the Dictionary of British Classicists performs the same work of silencing for the United Kingdom. The logical inference is that every single person profiled in these dictionaries gleaned the rewards of white supremacy, or that the final status of both projects is a direct reflection of the racial myopias of their respective editors and contributors, or both. The American Dictionary's introductory essay, with its punt on any direct responsibility for building a more racially inclusive practice of classics, in the process also models how not to practice a racially inclusive intellectual history of the discipline. It is the task of the next generation to attract blacks and Asians into classics, end quote, as if people of color had not been contributing to the discipline for generations. This dictionary's omission of the African-American classicist William Sanders Scarborough is about as striking as its deliberate cloaking of Princeton alum Basil Anu Gildersleeve's racism, which is finessed away through discreet reference to his defense of the Southern cause. Synthetic treatments of the discipline's past and present prospects that ditch biography in favor of topic or theme-based historical reconstruction have not fared much better. Neither the legacies of Greece or Rome nor the future of the classical are understood to intersect in any meaningful way with globe-spanning systems of race. Not only the future, but the past of the past has been subjected to searching scrutiny in 21st century histories of the discipline and its meta-narratives. Yet even here, the romance of ancient Greece and Rome's production of pastness and futureness tiptoes around race and racism, if the near total absence of these terms and their conceptual appurtenances from an otherwise wide-ranging collection of essays on the topic is any indication. One can confront the classics, but have very little to say about race or racism. Moreover, not only are there no standalone entries for either topic, or conceptually adjacent topics, and arguably the most labor-intensive project on the intellectual histories and genealogies of classics to have been published in the past decade, the classical tradition. Race is mentioned in exactly 3 entries, only one of which, on fascism, engages with the deployment of race as a technology of structural violence, and racism is mentioned a grand total of 3 times in the volume's 1,067 pages. With Frantz Fanon as one of its major inspirations and interlocutors, there's a now robust literature on the philosophical properties of race thinking, and this literature has really taken off in recent decades. This literature, much like the critical race literature that is absent from conversations of race and ethnicity in antiquity, is almost never consulted by classicists, even by scholars who are working in classical reception studies and who otherwise wear their theoretical fluency proudly. While several contributions to a new volume on classics in extremis do think with race, race and race theory are so marginal to the field and to how it conceptualizes itself as a field as not to receive any conceptual traction whatsoever in a recently published volume whose major theme is marginality and canonicity in classical studies. None of the contributions to a highly innovative joint venture into the geological and deep time structures of classics attends to the sedimentation of race in the bedrock of the discipline, even though its introductory essay flags 19th century philology's debts to evolutionary biology, a discipline whose traffic in racial science is no longer up for debate. Is it that race theory isn't viewed as sufficiently rigorous? Is it presumed to be able to speak to and on behalf of persons of color only? If one of the core dialectical features of whiteness is particularizing brown modes of being and theorizing in order to generalize itself, its kin is the troping of scholarship that characterizes the embodied knowledges of Black and brown communities as deficient in rigor. The product of both implicit and explicit bias, what Shelley Haley once termed, quote, the tendency among white academicians in all fields to equate greater minority involvement with a diminution of academic excellence, end quote, remains alive and well. As valediction, I'll end by commenting on a work that has gained in potency and texture as I contemplate my own rectificatory and reparative responsibilities as a classicist and as a historian of scholarship. It is a poem to which I was introduced by the Dominican-American poet and translator Gina Espaillat in the fall, and to which I keep returning because it gives me pleasure. At its core, this talk's roaming appetite for the historical and sociocultural formations within which the classical turns ghostly is fueled by a search for pleasure, and by a political commitment to the exaltation of those pleasures that arise not from the apotheosis of the textual above the human, but from the sharing of texts with fellow humans in an act of commensality. So I'll share this text that I can't keep from sharing by a Dominican-American poet who came to life for me in the living mouth of another Dominican-American poet. The poem, Areito por Todos, Ritual Song for Us All, is a miniature masterpiece from the pen of César Sánchez Beras and was chosen by Espaillat for inclusion in the Poetry of America series sponsored by the Library of Congress. You have the English translation on your slide. I'll read the Spanish. Me sacaron como apache de la llanura y del viento, me arrojaron como inca de la barca del silencio, pero vengo de la sombra, del pasado y del futuro, me sacaron como indio, pero vuelvo como negro. Me sacaron como negro del tambor de la esperanza, me negaron el trapiche para moler mis adentros, me negaron en Yoruba, en Bantú, Carabalí, pero vuelvo en la manigua, cimarrón en blanco y negro. Me sacaron por judío, por latino, por moreno, me sacaron por hispano, por guloya y por negrero, me sacaron de las nubes donde desudé la lluvia, me sacaron de los montes donde desnudé la tierra, pero vuelvo como indio, pero vuelvo como negro. Pero vuelvo en español, en yoruba y en taíno, regresando por los montes, estrenando un rostro nuevo. Vengo con el mascarón de los que no tienen patria, me sacaron, pero vuelvo, pero vuelvo. On the Library of Congress website, you can access Espaillat's resonant interpretation of Beras' poem, which he takes as an encomium to the indomitability of the forcibly displaced, not only indigenous communities uprooted by settler colonialism and Africans set in violent marine motion by the transatlantic slave trade, but the expulsions of Jews and Moors that are likewise equally implicated in the emergence of the early modern North Atlantic. For me, Espaillat's translation of me sacaron, as they tossed me away, has a flavor of that Virgilian jactatus through which one strand of ancient Mediterranean epic located a community's birth in the storm-tossed journey of the forcibly displaced. And there's no question that the poem opens itself up to a reading that exults in the power of the multiracial multitude to check and counteract the violences of empire. But without undercutting this interpretation, I'd like to offer a second one. The poem simultaneously centers empire's zest for racial and ethnic interpolation. They tossed me away as Apache, they tossed me away as black, etc. And the fragmentation of those racial and ethnic assignments. The first-person voice announces their triumphantly pluripotent return in Spanish, in Yoruba, and in Taíno, wearing the mask of those who have no country. In the quiet and steady resolve of return, the distinct and differentiable identities that emerge and are policed under the sign of empire no longer matter as much. These are tossed away as the first person of vengo and vuelvo moves to the forefront. That first-person voice professes to wear the mask of those who have no country, but by the mere fact of doing so, he does not enable them to recover or reanimate the lost. The tireless and indomitable are not the actual victims of imperial savagery, but instead the actor who, standing in an atrium that's stocked with imagines, selects personae and puts on a performance. The poem's success as a performance script for this ventriloquism rests on the supposition that the distinct historical traumas of settler colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade are amenable to recreation and enactment, that tragedy at this scale can be bounded by a feat of the poetic historical imagination. This, too, is an affect and pretension of the scholar-poet, to presume that one is capable of doing justice to the shades through the imagination and embodiments of performance. But I don't mind that pretension as much as I do the text fetishes of Sand's culture heroes that I discussed with reference to a history of classical scholarship earlier. I'll take the hauntology that bids me not to locate myself outside of the history of imperial subjection and slave or violence, but that enables me to assert myself within that history. And I hope to honor that invitation to bring blood to all the shades, and not merely those whose biographies rise and fall between the covers of race-oblivious and therefore race-inactive histories of classical scholarship. With that, I say thank you. Yeah, I'll take questions. I like questions. I'll take all questions.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. It made me think about, I work in Egyptology on imperialism. And in thinking about imperialism more broadly, I was interested in a lot of sort of use in the early 1900s of classical kind of texts as a how-to, you know, like there was Brits looking at India and saying, well, we're just not doing a good enough job. Look what the Romans did. They were able to, you know, assimilate everyone really quickly. And so I wonder if you can sort of, if there's a split between classics with literature and classics with history in terms of the kind of the use of classics in various ways. I mean, I guess it goes to your point that it's very much a white supremacist venture, but there it's a very intense dialogue, it seems like.
Well, thank you for that question. I don't think there's much of a split. So I want to get your invitation as clear in my head as possible. So there's certainly a recourse to mobilizing classical texts and to mobilizing evidence collected across text and material culture in the service of empire in 19th and 20th century contexts. That much is obvious. And I think that recourse is enabled by shifting institutional configurations, from changes to pedagogy and curricula at Oxbridge on one side of the Atlantic and in American institutions on the other side. But there are other aspects to this that, while not as immediately perceptible, nonetheless also exert a kind of short, medium, and long-term impact on the trajectories of classics. It's tempting, I think, to do what one will find in histories of classical scholarship and locate in the figure of, say, the textual critic, the detached with manuscripts and collation practitioner of classics, an entity who somehow operates at a remove from, say, the kinds of activity that are routed from instruction in Roman history to a command under one of the British imperial overseers abroad, right? And to say, this is one kind of work and that's another, and they're sort of separate. But I don't think they're that separate. I think they actually operate along and within the same continuum of practices. They are plugged into the same sociological networks. Quite frequently we see one and the same person doing one and then doing the other. So there is no gap, no meaningful gap, or at least a gap that's sufficient for me to say that these are two independent structures with little to no crossover.
Thank you for this talk. I have two questions. I'm sorry, I can't choose. The first one...
I'll choose for you. Ha.
Okay, yeah. You should. But the first one being, I strongly love this presentation, agree with everything you said, but I was wondering if you had any suggestions for people who are at points in their careers where they aren't Princeton University professors, and sometimes especially for students or those who might be as more vulnerable to some of the harsher impacts of epistemicide, like if there are any strategies or ways of dealing with that you might point students to. And then to engage more directly with what you're saying, I wanted to clarify about back to the point on plantations, because I think there's such interesting sites in this country, especially of trying to codify personal identity via the classics. You have all of this classical architecture. You have the need for all of these slave bodies. Serena Shaw at Harvard doing excellent work on the classical names of all of these slaves, Octavia, Titus, and like the fact of these dealing with classical things in an imperfect way and attempting to mediate through that. I was wondering if you're suggesting that a lot of plantations and sites like that in this country operate as sort of haunted houses of like classical ideology and its impact upon the country.
So I'm going to give a short answer to your second question and then move to your first question. The short answer is yes, I am suggesting that. But I'm not going to... there are other people, including several people you mentioned, who are doing far better work on this front. I would also single out the work of Lyra Monteiro as exemplary for illustrating the connections between plantations and the incubation and perpetuation of classicizing and neoclassicizing ideologies of white supremacy. So that work is awesome, and everyone should go out and digest it. In response to the first question, I had an answer and then reconsidered it. So the answer I was going to give was, well, if as you're making your way through your undergraduate education, or if you decide to make the mistake of going to graduate school, one should be in a position of identifying or trying to identify what is being withheld from view by the choices that you make in terms of the things you study. But I then realized that this is sort of it is paradoxical to offer this kind of advice. And so I'll default to something I've written about in connection with epistemicide, in which I discuss a little bit in the memoir. When I became familiarized or socialized into the pursuit of classics, it occurred at a time when I was really preoccupied with Dominican history. But I mean, there were no books on Dominican history to which I had any access at all. There were, however, books on the Greeks and Romans. And so I just started reading. And wow, was I charismatically ensnared in short order. But I was charismatically ensnared by a deficit, right? So it wasn't only that these books somehow exercised a kind of mystique over me because they spoke about these, in very grandiloquent terms sometimes, about the legacies of the smooth, colorful ways of life that have been handed down to us. It was also the case that I was vulnerable because there was an act of epistemic injustice being perpetrated on me, and I did not have the vocabulary to even grasp what that could mean, let alone the conceptual resources to properly explicate to myself what the long-term implications of that were, right? So I guess the advice would be to embrace the recognition that the choices that one makes in terms of the disciplines one pursues, in terms of the studies one sets up as central to their own formation, are choices that implicate you in loss. The question is how tolerable those losses are.
Thank you. So I guess the answer to epistemicide on one end is epistemological reparations. Mm-hmm. And it is those same reparations that the predominantly white body of classical scholars consistently deny scholars of color in the community. Mm-hmm. And on the other end of that, it is the students of color under the pedagogical structures in which we study who are forced to either reproduce the haunted houses themselves consistently or seek refuge in other disciplines. So I'm guessing, where do you see the hope in the field to actually repair and unhaunt its own house? Because in the act of giving blood to ghosts, you are just also living in a system that is creating more ghosts that require more blood. And the cycle seems never ending to decolonize the field.
I don't know what the hope is. The reason I don't know is because lately I've had to reconsider many of the sort of provisional ad hoc strategies that I had developed at earlier points to find or locate a way forward. Let me give an illustration of this. So some years ago, when I reflected on how I wanted to be a mentor, an advisor, an instructor to graduate students, especially in the context of training grad students, I thought, I really want to model non-mastery, right? Like I don't want to generate and exhibit or showcase the kinds of forms of disciplinary performance that had featured very prominently in my own formation, right? And I tried to design seminars in which I not just sort of took a back seat in terms of conversation and so on, but in which I tried to model as open-ended an interpretive approach and as open-ended a way of inhabiting and being with texts as possible. One that tried to meet folks where they were and also tried to empower them as interpreters and interlocutors of the text. I still believe in this, even though I have plenty of pedagogical work to do. But what has come across my radar recently is the sense from some of the folks with whom I've worked that there's, I don't know how else to put this, that they want something that I'm not giving them. that they want someone to, propound or hold authoritatively on X, Y, or Z. And I don't like doing this. I am temperamentally averse to doing this. So I'm not quite sure what to do right now. So on one level, I know that there are things that I count as quanta of knowledge of a kind about which I have very strong opinions that I believe are grounded in fact, right? So if it's a matter of historical interpretation of certain events or certain texts, if it's a matter of parsing text, if it's a matter of talking about what might constitute a heuristically valid approach to a question, what might constitute a heuristically valid interpretative approach to the reconstruction of certain incidents in Greek or Roman history, I feel that I can, within reason, in a classroom context, assert that there are some valid principles for engagement. Like, I am not completely agnostic. But where matters become difficult is in the gap between the preference for the sort of more muted and more understated mode of encountering and projecting out a set of commitments that coalesce around what I understand to be the practice of ancient historical scholarship or classical scholarship, and the expectations of some of my students. Not all, but some. Right? And so finding an acceptable common ground for this that doesn't wittingly or unwittingly reinscribe and reify forms of domination has been a source of constant concern. I would go so far as to say that it is one of the things I think about the most on a daily basis. And as I said earlier, I don't really know what to do other than keep reading and hope that I stumble across some effective strategies and talk to colleagues about what is working. So.
Hi, Donnell.
Hey.
Thanks for this. So my question is a permutation on Aditi's question. And it comes from having attended a talk by Emily Greenwood day before yesterday, where she argued that traditional philology is a powerful mechanism precisely for dismantling structures of power, race, and exploitation in the discipline. So I'm struck by that kind of hope, right? That is, if we do the old-fashioned thing and wed it to some theory, contemporary theory, we can really do some dismantling. And what I might take as your more radical view, or at least the sort of subtle implication of your more radical view, that maybe this whole ship is rotten to the core. And so then my question, from the vantage of faculty, what do we do in terms of the curriculum? What would a classical curriculum look like? Would it, in your idea, would it look, let me just leave it there. I mean, I have some modulations on that. Would it seek to empower through philology? Would it seek to dismantle through critique? Would it just be something totally different?
So, I wish you were coming to dinner, because then we could talk about this at length. But you're not, so now I have to take a crack at a simplifying answer. So I don't disagree with Emily. And I think that she's modeled through a series of very carefully crafted textual interventions, how you do this at a very high level. What I would want for more undergraduate and graduate curricula to take on board, and what I will limit myself to teasing out for now, is a more robust attention to the machinery of scholarship, right? So this would have two parts. This would first do histories of classical scholarship in the way that I think would be most responsive to the interactive force of classics encounter with the structures of power that I outlined in the talk. But that means several things. So let me give one concrete illustration. Earlier, with reference to the generic and emplotment devices of a history of classical scholarship, I zeroed in on two anecdotes, both of which foreground the importance of travel as a prerequisite to the securing and study and stabilization of those texts that can then, in the hands of several generations of critics and interpreters, serve as the springboard for the constitution of what becomes the classical. Travel is really important, right? Being able to move in the direction of accessing these texts is important. But with travel, you also get, and with these anecdotes, you see quite explicitly put up to the light, the rearticulation of structures of domination that enable scholars to travel and that enable them to take what they want when they want it. And this played out many times over is a history of classical scholarship that needs more sustained and critical attention, right? So I have, over the course of the past few years, revisited all of these passages in histories of classical scholarship that used to move me a great deal. I mean, some of them were quite moving, right? You know, people scaling mountains in order to take squeezes of inscriptions. I see John Ma over there. Like, this is, you know, like people engaging in all these sort of these risky, these perilous, fatal exploits. Just the other day, I was rereading this story about the Dutch scholar Vossius the Elder, who dies in the lap of the Muses. He falls from a staircase in his library. I mean, this is what happens when you become too obsessed with your books. You die in your library, right? But like, I mean, the reason I cite these and other anecdotes, and the reason I made a point of citing these two anecdotes in the talk itself, is because I think that they perform a work that has to be demystified for students, right? On the one hand, we are taught not just a set of tools for practicing classics, whether these are philological tools or ancient historical tools, or the tools of the epigraphist trade. We are also taught a set of affects for appreciating and reverencing the folks who have come before us and the sacrifices that they have had to make. And I don't want to throw all that out, but I think it needs to be interrogated quite carefully, right? Because some of the people who are busy, you know, slogging away in summers in Egypt were not good people, right? Like, I mean, yes, you might think, oh, look at these photos of Grenfell and Hunt. They, you know, they look cool in their little cosplay or whatever. But like, this entire matrix of domination was not one that we should necessarily extol without seriously critiquing it beforehand. Right? So that's the kind of work I think that needs to happen whenever we talk about how better to equip and train students. If it's a matter of moving ahead with the refinement and recalibration of some of those tools in classics and its subfields that are already in play and that are already enshrined in curricula. If my sort of fever dream of you know, blowtorching things doesn't sort of come to pass, then at a minimum, I would say we got to be better historians of classical scholarship. Like that's the baseline as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I have so many thoughts, and one also was at Greenwood's talk, and it came to mind that language mastery is an interesting issue. What is entailed, because when she presented the passage on Aristotle, I noticed the way that the different ramifications of the katao root play out in the key passage justifying slavery. And I had never looked at that before, and I left the talk thinking, kind of, what is entailed in this, you know, sort of pride that we all have in being able to tell what the etymology of a term is, kind of following the blossoming of different roots and so on like that, and thinking that sort of constitutes learning, that you know, and then it turns out within the context of Aristotle's argument that there's a slide there, and that that play of different forms all coming out of the Katawa root are actually a kind of pseudo-logic justifying slavery. And so I just wanted to throw that out there as a possible topic. But what I really want to ask you about is Enoch Powell.
Ask, and ye shall receive.
Because I always loved Herodotus, and I spent some time at Hebrew University. I met Chaim Rosain, and he said to me in Hebrew, which I barely understood, but it meant a lot to me to be there and doing classics in Hebrew, because during the 90s, when I was coming out, I was not on board with classics. I felt that there was something missing and so on, and that I needed to learn a non-Indo-European language and kind of get with my roots and all that. And so Chaim Rosain, who had fled the Anschluss and all that, and he told this story about how he met Enoch Powell, who, by the way, is not referred to as Enoch Powell in the context of classics, but some other Powell's Lexicon and all that kind of thing. And he said, I met Enoch Powell and I shook his hand and he complimented me on my work and then he said, he said to us, I didn't agree with his politics. Very understated, Anyway, and then recently a biography came out of Powell, and it talked about his speeches and so on, and but it failed to address the question of why he was a Herodotus scholar. So far as I know, from the review in the London Review of Books, I haven't gotten around, partly because I have a massive block on this whole subject, to sort of reading the biography. But for people who don't know, there was a speech which Powell gave, I think in the early 80s, which was, sort of instrumental to launching or relaunching a form of white supremacy. If you disagree with this narrative, I'd also be interested in, or want to correct aspects of it. But to me, this was sort of like a schizoid feeling that I've lived with for a long time, of sort of working with the lexicon and really loving the lexicon, So I just toss that out there in case you had any comment. And thank you again, because okay.
Yeah, it's hard for me to find sort of foothold for a comment, because you put a lot of things on the table, and for that I'm grateful. I'll start at the end and then maybe work my way back, although I recognize that we should probably allow a few other folks to ask questions too. So there's this vexed question of what we do with, and what I do with scholars for whom it can be said not only that I object to their politics, but that I object to their entire way of being in the world. Powell's racist, straight up, right? Let's call it for how it is. And it has been revealing to observe the paraphrastic dances that occur when classicists write about other classicists of questionable politics. So I was reading some time ago a brief write-up on Tenny Frank by Jerzy Lenderski. And Frank, definitely racist. And a scholar whose perspectives on race deeply infuse one of his most cited articles. Lenderski very euphemistically refers to Frank's penchant for Mendelian genetics and leaves it at that. That's it, right? Now, I think there's a responsibility to be honest. Let's not practice evasions here. But the more sort of searing question is, faced with scholarship whose racial politics is right at the surface, right at the front, what do I do, right? But then the question that you pose is, what do you do with folks whose intellectual commitments do not at first blush, whose scholarly practices do not at first blush seem to be a direct or unmediated reflection of their racial commitments? I have a hard time with this, partly because I don't think that once you subject the works of these scholars to examination, they pass the test of separating their scholarship from their racial ideological formations. Like, I mean, if you start digging, you will find it. It is there. But I recognize that this is something that is going to require a lot of negotiation by classicists as individuals and as collectives. Because there are many, many, many folks in the field of classics whose production of scholarship has relied on not only their positions of privilege as being, in many cases, white cisgender folk, but has also relied on the occlusion of other voices and the continuing and repetitive occlusion of those voices through citational practices that systematically privilege those folks over others, right? So after a time spent thinking that we should not automatically fire up damnatio memoriae for some scholars, I've thought, you know what? I could cite other people. We could all cite other people. We good. Like let's go down that route. Let's see where it takes us. And I think it has to be. I think it has to be done critically and with some amount of deliberation. But I am not in principle averse to this. I think that it's time we consider how to open up the citational economy within which we work. And if it so happens that there are some folks in the field whose collusion with racial politics is deeply problematic and has left detectable traces in their work, then we might think, okay, maybe it's not the world's greatest thing to be citing this person anymore. Maybe we can cite other folks too. But this speaks to a still larger problem in classics, which is that if I one day get enough funding from my current employer to run a large-scale meta-study of publications, both article length and book length in classics over the past 50 years, and to study specifically the citational practices of these publications. What I suspect, based on some selective sampling I've already done, that I'll find is that classics is more repetitively fixated on citing practitioners who are either styled as classicists or who do work to certify themselves as classicists by citing other classicists than other humanities fields, and that this is like actually quantifiable. And that would be yet another reason why it would make sense to reconceptualize the citational economy of classics.
So I'm going to close with the comments.
Yes,
not
yes, the
question.
comment. I like the comment.
So 3 comments. One is, when we continue to bring blood to ghosts, it's more of a sort of rhetorical question, whose blood do we bring, right? But the second is I think the other question I think that's floating in the air that needs to be or issue that's floating that needs to be raised is this question of gender politics and what we do about former faculty at Columbia, right, who continue to be cited and continue to have access to spaces that vulnerable people must use and cannot exit, right? And I think there's a really important alignment up to a certain point of these issues here that need more direct address. And then there's finally this politics of citation that you bring up, and you're probably aware of Walter's kind of recent documentation of the most cited, I think it was Roman historians. And it was very telling which names showed up on the basis of the journals that he mined, and of course the journals that he did not mine. And those are my comments.
I think the comment should reverberate. I'll only say in response to the last point about citational politics that other folks in this room have done thinking about this as well. Joe Quinn is here, so shout out to Joe. I'll also say, apropos of the first point, that the past few years have required me to renegotiate relationships with people who were supportive of me, but who were very destructive of other people's careers. And sometimes I see, both online and offline, this tendency to defend scholars who are being justly excoriated, in my view, on the grounds that they were either good to me or they produced such excellent work, or some combination of the two. They were good to me and they did excellent work. And I think this gotta go. Like, someone could be good to you and also be a terrible, terrible person to many others. And in fact, their goodness to you, their performance of goodness to you, might be conditional on their capacity to exploit others. It might rest securely on the shoulders of the privileges that they enjoy that enable them for decades to exploit others. We good?